This lecture is the first part of 4 covering different time periods in the history of leisure. You will notice that you need to read in Chapter 1, page 9 through 23 for all 4 of the modules. This first lecture, we're going to identify how early societies valued work and leisure, understand their role of leisure, identify how we understand their views of leisure, and compare and contrast some of the similarities and differences. There are 5 different time periods or eras of recreation and leisure that we will discuss. The pre-literate and agriculture are what we are going to cover during this lecture. The pre-literate eras can go back to the beginning of time. And what little we understand about that usually comes from stones and artwork that we find, and that can include Indians and Egyptians. We understand during these time periods that survival was the most important aspect, and often what we know about some of these cultures is that work and leisure didn't necessarily have different definitions. They would not separate, oh, I worked for this long preparing food, so I'm going to relax for this period of time. That their life rhythm was centered around the times of the year, the seasons. It was not centered around a clock, which you will learn about more. And so time meant something very different to them. Work and leisure was together, and survival was of the utmost importance. We know American Indian culture as well as Egyptian culture became very developed over time, that they had different tribes, groups, settlements, different languages. The Egyptians went on to have very complicated civilizations. Much of their civilization centered around the Nile and the water and the importance of that, just like the American Indians centered around the sun and the rain and the different spirits that they thought went with the different seasons. Some of the early history that we know more about centers around ancient Greek, Rome, the early Polynesians, and we're going to talk about each one of these just briefly. When we look at ancient Greece, that's where we really start to see the class structures emerge. And what we do know about ancient Greece and Rome is that their civilizations were based on a slave system. And so when they went and conquered new lands, or they were not born as an aristocrat in that society, that they were then part of the working class. And so much of the leisure that was experienced, for instance, in Greece, was by the wealthier, more elite class. One thing that is important to know of Greece is they felt like leisure was the means to the good life. They had a lot of value in leisure. Also, the word leisure oftentimes is interpreted through Latin and other languages as scholae, which you may remember means to school. And so often leisure meant the pursuit of scholarship, whether that was reading, thinking, debating, discussing, and studying. And it was very important. Some of our great philosophers come from this time. Also remember during the Greek era, the Olympics. We can trace the roots back to that the first Olympic Games were held every 4 years, and they had different, foot races and running races, and that goes back as early as 7 and 800 BC. Remember that much of the Olympic Games early on was naked, and so the women were not allowed at those games. They had often their own games, the Heraea Games that were held every 4 years to honor the goddess. And so, Greece has a really rich history in their relationship with leisure. And as we move on to Rome, I think that there are lots of things that, scholars debate about Romans, but we have this idea that they were definitely military conquerors. Also, their civilization was based on a slave system, and so depending on what class you were on was whether they had conquered your land. If they conquered you, they could have brought you back. One of the things that's really important about Rome, despite their downfall that we'll discuss in a minute, but many of their projects in engineering, including roads, bridges, temples, theaters, they have entire towns and cities throughout Africa and Europe that still stand on Roman foundations. And so they were real innovators when it came to developing cities. Rome really began to rise to power in 200 BC all the way through 200 AD. And, Rome is often criticized as the way that they used leisure. And they really started mass leisure, which are these ideas of these heated public baths. They would have parades, ball games, and these grand athletic exhibitions. And, it's argued that that was the way that they controlled the middle class. And unlike the Greeks, the middle class was invited to come to these mass exhibitions. And we often know those as the gladiator games. Of course, you've probably seen the popular movies about those. They would bring in political prisoners, criminals, slaves, and bring in wild animals like lions and tigers, and they would have to fight the humans to the death. Probably their most biggest spectacle was when they boarded 19,000 men to a fleet of 50 ships, flooded the whole stadium, and they had like a war, a battle, where over 3,000 men were dead. And so, some of this is attributed to the Roman downfall as the spectacles became more popular and widely used. It certainly had issues for them. Also note that during these times are when much of our religion is formed. You have Jesus Christ being born during this time. You also have Muhammad's early empire with the founding of Islam. And so there's some really interesting culture and history. Also, the first tourists are noted with the early Polynesians, with Hawaii being one of the world's most popular tourist destinations then and now. And although people didn't realize what they were doing, Hawaii was certainly a very popular place to trade goods and a beautiful location. And so it's important for us to understand some of our early history, where the culture comes from, because oftentimes the way different cultures view leisure really plays an impact on how we view leisure today.